Welcome to Extraordinary Creatives. I'm Kerry Hand, 35 years as a gallerist, curator and institutional director, now coaching artists and creative leaders to build creative lives that reward them. 2 episodes a week on audio and video, an honest conversation with an extraordinary creative about their work and their life, and a shorter deep dive into the mindset and strategy questions creative people actually face. Thanks for being here. Let's get into it. There's something I've been thinking about for quite a while now, and it's something that I've talked about with close friends, but hardly ever publicly. Not because it's a secret, and certainly not because I'm embarrassed by it. I think, if I'm honest, I just never wanted it to define me. But over the last few years, I've realised that by not talking about it, I've probably left out one of the biggest reasons I think the way I do. And because so many of you write or talk to me about long COVID, chronic fatigue, chronic pain, autoimmune conditions, endometriitis, burnout, clinical depression, and all the other things that change what we're capable of physically and mentally, it feels like the right time to have this conversation. Now, before we go any further, I want to be really clear about something. I'm obviously not a doctor and I'm not a neuroscientist. I'm not here to tell you how to treat your illness or suggest that if you just meditate enough or think positively enough, everything will somehow be fine. Everything I'm sharing today comes from my own lived experience, from nearly 40 years working in the arts and from coaching thousands of creative people. But I also want to acknowledge that there's an enormous spectrum of experience when we're talking about illness, disability, and caring responsibilities. I'm not suggesting for a moment that my experience is the same as somebody living with MS, Parkinson's, advanced autoimmune disease, lifelong disability, severe chronic pain, or someone caring full-time for a loved one. It isn't, nor would I ever compare my experience with somebody else's, or your experience with somebody else's for that matter. So this isn't a conversation about whose circumstances are harder. It's about recognizing that when our bodies or our minds no longer allow us to move through the world in the way we once did, something shifts in our identity, our confidence, and often our creative life too. What I can speak to is what it feels like to spend years quietly adapting, to calculate whether you've got enough energy to get across a city for a meeting, to wonder whether you'll make it through a full day's work and still have enough left to see friends afterwards. To know that saying yes to something wonderful today might mean paying for it tomorrow. I know what it's like to carry those calculations around in the background for years. And through coaching so many extraordinary creative people, I've also had the privilege of learning from artists and cultural workers living with a huge range of experiences that are very different from my own. Many of them have taught me as much as I've ever taught them. So today I'm sharing one perspective, one person's experience of trying to build a meaningful creative life when the conditions aren't the ones they would have chosen. And some tools and techniques I've shared with my coaching clients that have worked. Before we finish, I also want to acknowledge something else. Many of the challenges that disabled and chronically ill artists faced aren't personal at all. They're structural. They're about access, attitudes, economics, and an art world that still too often assumes everyone can participate in the same way. And that's too important to squeeze in today's conversation. So in the next episode, I'd like to explore that properly. I'll be drawing on the work of disabled artists, curators and organisations such as Dash, alongside people like Aidan Mosby, artist and curator, and others who have spent years leading thinking in this area. We'll look at access riders, asking for what you need, and how we can begin creating in creative environments where more people can flourish. Because understanding ourselves is only part of the story. The systems we work within matter too, of course. What I do know something about is creativity. I know something about building a meaningful life when the conditions aren't ideal. I know something about adapting and rebuilding, and I know something about the stories our brains tell us when life doesn't turn out the way we imagined it would. That's really what I want to talk about today. Some of you will know that my dad died when I was 19. It happened just before I left home to go to art college. And at the time, I don't think I appreciated quite how enormous that was. And looking back with the benefit of age and having spent years now studying coaching psychology, the nervous system, I can see that I probably did what a lot of young people or grieving people do. I kept moving. I threw myself into college, into making work, into meeting people, in trying to build a future. There wasn't really any space to stop and process what had actually happened. I blew my life up in so many ways I can't tell you. Somehow I came into my own in the final year. Then instead of going to my graduation, I went travelling around India for 3 months. It was beautiful, chaotic, overwhelming, exhilarating. One of those trips that changes the way you see the world. Towards the end of it, I became incredibly ill and I contracted dysentery and malaria, double whammy. I recovered enough to come home and life carried on. Or at least that's what I thought. But every now and again, I'd have these periods where I was completely wiped out. Not tired. Tired is something most of us understand. This is something different. It felt as though somebody had simply unplugged me. My body didn't seem to belong to me anymore. My brain became foggy. Decisions that should have taken 30 seconds suddenly felt impossible. And things I'd normally have found easy took enormous effort. At first I assumed everybody felt like it and simply coped better than I did. Then I assumed I wasn't trying hard enough. Then I wondered whether I was imagining it. And because I was young, ambitious, and absolutely loved making art and working in the arts, I did what so many of us do. I carried on. I went to the doctor. They were a bit baffled. I kept working. I tried not to make a fuss. I didn't want to become somebody who couldn't cope. Years later, I contracted glandular fever. And this time, I never really came back to where I'd been before. Eventually, I was diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome. That was decades ago before people really talked about it. So there really wasn't much understanding and there certainly wasn't the kind of research or community that exists today. So I adapted quietly. That's probably the best way I can describe it. From the outside, I imagined that I looked completely fine. I was running exhibitions, leading teams, travelling, speaking, building projects, saying yes to opportunities that genuinely excited me. People often tell me now, you've always had so much energy, and I always smile because that's never really been how it felt. What people couldn't see was the constant calculation happening in the background. Could I afford to go out tonight? If I travelled this week, what would that cost me next week? If I accepted this opportunity, what would I have to quietly give up in order to make it happen? I'd often pour everything I had into work because I loved it so much, but there frequently wasn't much left afterwards. Friends would invite me out and I'd cancel at the last minute because I simply couldn't do another evening. I'd spend whole weekends recovering from the week. Sometimes I'd push through because I wanted so badly to be the person I remembered being. And every time I ignored my body, I'd pay for it. For years, I honestly thought this was just my private battle. Something to work around, something to hide, something I'd eventually overcome. But over the last 20 years, something unexpected has happened. I've now coached thousands of creative people. And again, people have trusted me with stories about illness, pain, burnout, trauma, loss, caring responsibilities, and all the unexpected twists that life throws at us. Their circumstances have all been different. Their diagnoses have all been different. But the conversation underneath them has been remarkably similar. Nobody says to me, I'm frightened because I'm ill. What they actually say is, I don't know who I am anymore. I can't work the way I used to. I don't know if I can build the life I wanted. I feel as though everybody else is moving forwards without me. And every time I hear those words, something inside me recognizes them. Because sometimes I don't actually think the hardest part is the illness. Don't get me wrong, I know that's really tough. But I think often the hardest part is what it quietly takes away. Not just energy, not just certainty, but identity. And I think that's the part we don't talk about nearly enough. Because if we don't understand that, we'll spend years trying to solve the wrong problem. And that's exactly what I did. Subconsciously, I thought my job was to be a version of who I'd been before. I don't know if you've ever caught yourself doing that, but it's such an easy trap to fall into. You remember a version of yourself that seemed to have endless energy. You remember saying yes to everything. You remember making more work, seeing more people, traveling more, fitting more into a day than feels imaginable now. And without really noticing it, you start measuring today's version of yourself against yesterday's. It's an impossible comparison because the person you're comparing yourself with doesn't exist anymore. That doesn't mean they've disappeared. It means life has changed. I know you find the art world baffling sometimes. It is. This is exactly why I built the membership. Inside the membership, artists rebuild their confidence. They reignite their pride. They recover their sense of play and finally feel like they belong. They land studio visits, sales, shows, better fees, stronger relationships, and a genuine sense of agency. Here's how it works. You get the online membership hub on your laptop or phone and gain instant access to every live session, replay and worksheet, as well as an active community, so you're never stuck waiting for an answer again. You get weekly advice sessions with me where you can ask me anything you're stuck with, and I'm going to give you straight, honest answers. And you get coaching with me at an affordable rate. Plus, there are real-life meetups, expert webinars, monthly studio visits with members, and 4 guest artist studio visits a year where you can ask your own questions live. And the best bit? It's an affordable price every month and you can cancel anytime. So please don't keep struggling on a loan. Try it. 2 months from now, you could have answers to things that have been holding you back for years. I think one of the biggest shifts for me came when I realised I wasn't just dealing with an illness. I was grieving, not just for my dad, but nobody had ever said that to me. I'd always thought grief belonged to bereavement, to losing another person. I hadn't realised you could grieve your own life. You can grieve your energy. You can grieve the spontaneity you used to have. You can grieve the version of yourself that would say yes to an invitation without first wondering what it would cost tomorrow. You can grieve opportunities that never happened, relationships that changed, plans you quietly let go of. And because nobody really calls it grief, we often end up feeling guilty instead. We think we should be coping better. We think we should be more positive. We think we should just get on with it. But I wonder if some of what you're carrying isn't failure at all. I wonder if it's loss. That landed quite heavily for me when I first started thinking about it. Because grief asks something different of us. It isn't a problem to solve. It isn't something we can tick off a list. It asks to be acknowledged, to be felt, to be given a little space. And I think that's particularly difficult for creative people because most of us are problem solvers. We like making things happen. We like finding a way through. We're resourceful. So when our body stops behaving in the way it always has, our instinct is to throw that same determination at it. I'll work harder, I'll find the answer, I'll push through. I know that voice because I lived with it for years. Sometimes it got me through, sometimes it made things much worse. And one thing I've noticed both in myself and in clients is how quickly the brain starts looking for certainty. It wants a timeline. When will I be better? Will I ever get back to normal? What if this is forever? And if it can't answer those questions, it does something else. It starts living in the past or worrying in the future. It replays the version of your life that felt easier. It quietly edits your memories until it feels as though you used to be able to do everything all the time effortlessly. Now, maybe that's true, but I suspect like most of us, there were difficult days then too. But the brain has a habit of remembering the highlights and forgetting the ordinary Tuesdays. So we're comparing today's reality with yesterday's highlights reel. No wonder we feel as though we're losing. Something I found really helpful is imagining 3 versions of ourselves. There's the person we were, there's the person we are today, and there's the person we imagined we'd become. When life changes unexpectedly, those three people stop walking together. The past version keeps saying, you used to manage this. The future version keeps drifting further away. And the present version is left standing in the middle, wondering which one to believe. I think that's where so much suffering comes from. Not just from pain, not just from fatigue, but from constantly trying to become somebody we've already been. The phrase I use a lot with clients is radical acceptance. And I know that can sound a bit fluffy maybe for you, or it might sound like giving up, but that's not what I mean. Acceptance isn't approval. It isn't saying, I'm happy this has happened. Acceptance isn't giving up on treatment or ensuring that things improve. It's simply saying, this is where I am today. Because once we stop arguing with today's reality, something interesting happens. All of that energy that we've been spending trying to recreate yesterday become available for something else. Curiosity. That's where I always come back to. Not criticism, curiosity. Instead of asking, why can't I do what I want to do or what I used to do, I started asking, what helps? It's such a small question, but honestly, it changed my life. Because the moment I stopped trying to force my body to become the body I'd had years earlier, I became much more interested in understanding the body I actually had. I stopped seeing it as the enemy. I started seeing it as something I needed to learn from. And that's where everything began to shift. One small observation at a time. Because creativity, when you're really thinking about it, it's never just been about making paintings or writing books or composing music. Creativity is our ability to work with and respond to reality, to adapt, to notice, to imagine another way forward. And perhaps that's exactly what's being asked of us here. Not to recreate the life we had before, but to become creative enough to build a beautiful life from where we are now. I know that's easy to say, much harder to live. But once I stopped trying to get my old life back, I found myself asking a completely different question. Not how do I get it back, but what are the conditions that allow this version of me to flourish? And that question has shaped almost everything I've done since. And I think it might be one of the most useful questions I've asked myself. What are the conditions that allow this version of me to flourish? Not survive, but flourish. There's a difference because surviving is often about getting through the day. Flourishing is about building a life that's still interesting, still meaningful, and still feels like yours. That took me years to understand. I think for a long time, if I'm honest, I believed that I had two choices. I could either keep trying to live exactly as I always had and keep crashing, or I could accept that my life had become smaller. Neither of those options appealed to me. I love being curious. I love learning. I love meeting fascinating people, discovering artists, reading books that change my mind, traveling, making things, coaching, recording this podcast, writing, speaking, having ideas at stupid times of the day and disappearing down rabbit holes, probably like you, because something catches my attention. None of that has changed. I'm still that person. If anything, I'm more curious now than I've ever been. What has changed is that I've become much more interested in the conditions that allow me to live that life. I've realised I need more sleep than I used to think I did. I've realised I can't spend 3 days in a row surrounded by people, however much I enjoy them, because afterwards I'll need days to recover. I've stopped drinking alcohol because I realised I simply feel better without it. I started going to the gym in my 50s, not because I suddenly became interested in looking different, but because I finally understood that physical strength helps me keep doing the work that I love. I pay much more attention to what I eat because I've noticed how dramatically it affects my energy and my concentration. I think much more carefully about when I write, where I write, how much I put into one day, which invitations I say yes to, which ones I politely decline. Years ago, I'd probably have looked at the list and thought it sounded incredibly boring and restrictive. Do you know, now it feels like freedom, because those aren't rules, they're conditions. They're the conditions that allow me to keep building the kind of life that I want. And I hope this is the important bit. Your conditions won't look like mine. If you have illness, You know how it feels, but it's important for you to discover your own conditions. Become fascinated by yourself in a scientific study kind of way. And honestly, this is, I think, one of the most creative projects that you could undertake. Start noticing instead of judging. When do you usually feel most like yourself? Is there a time of day when thinking feels clearer? What kind of conversations leave you feeling energized? Which ones leave you feeling utterly drained? Where do your best ideas tend to arrive? What happens just before a good day? What happens just before a difficult one? If you were studying a beautiful old building or a work of art, you'd spend time carefully looking before jumping to conclusions. I'd encourage you to offer yourself the same curiosity. Become a student of your own well-being. One thing I genuinely recommend is keeping a notebook for a few weeks. Not a symptom diary, a curiosity diary. There's a difference. On one side of the page, write things that give me energy. On the other side, write things that cost me energy. Don't try to change anything just yet, just notice. Maybe you'll discover that one conversation with somebody you love gives you more energy than an entire day scrolling your phone. Maybe you'll notice that natural light helps, or music, or being outside. Maybe you'll discover that working for 45 minutes is brilliant, but trying to work for 4 hours is where everything starts to unravel. Those observations become incredibly valuable because you're no longer asking your body to behave like someone else's. You're learning the language of your own. And then something starts to happen. You stop managing time, you start managing energy. And I think that's one of the biggest shifts I've made. For years, I thought I needed to become better at time management. And now I realize that time wasn't really the issue, energy was. We all get 24 hours. What differs is the quality of those hours. So now I ask myself different questions. Where's my best hour today? What deserves that hour? What can wait? What can I prepare today that will make tomorrow easier? And perhaps my favourite question of all, what can I do today that won't make tomorrow harder? I don't think we ask ourselves that question often enough, especially creative people, because we're passionate, we get excited, we have an idea and want to stay up till 2 a.m. finishing it. And sometimes that's wonderful. Sometimes it's borrowing energy for the next 3 days. And one thing I've learned, and I still have to remind myself of this regularly, is that creativity doesn't disappear because I stop working. Sometimes it's quietly gathering itself. Sometimes the walk is part of the work. Sometimes the rest is part of the work. Now, everything I've shared about understanding your energy, your conditions, and your framework has to be held alongside something else: curiosity and courage. Because our brains are wonderfully inventive. They don't just try to keep us physically safe, they try to keep us emotionally safe as well. Sometimes they'll tell us we're protecting our energy when actually we're protecting ourselves from uncertainty or rejection or embarrassment or the possibility that something might not go the way we'd hoped. I know that because I've caught myself doing it, and as an introvert, it would be very easy for me to convince myself that staying at home is always the wisest option. Sometimes it genuinely is, and sometimes it's simply the easier option. Those aren't the same thing. And over the years, I've realized that one of the most important questions I can ask is, am I saying no because my body needs me to, or because I'm secretly scared? They're very different experiences. Your body might genuinely need the rest. Your brain might simply need reassurance. Learning the difference takes time, it takes honesty, and it takes practice. And I think of it as being like an investor. Every day we wake up with a certain amount of physical, emotional, and creative energy. The question isn't, how do I save every bit of it? The question is, where will I invest it today? Some investments give us a wonderful return. A brilliant conversation, meeting someone who changes the direction of your work, visiting an exhibition that reminds you why you became an artist in the first place, sending the email you've been putting off, making the work even though it feels vulnerable. Those things cost energy, but they give something back. Other things simply drain us. Scrolling for an hour, saying yes because we feel guilty, trying to be everything to everybody, arguing with ourselves, comparing our lives to somebody else's. Those rarely give us much in return. So I'm not encouraging you to make your life smaller, quite the opposite. I'm encouraging you to become much more intentional about where your energy goes. Protect it from the things that simply deplete you. Invest it in the things that help you grow. Sometimes that investment will feel uncomfortable. Growth often does. You might walk into a private view feeling anxious. You might introduce yourself to someone you've admired for years. You might finally send the application that's been sitting on your desktop. Those moments might leave you tired, but they may also leave you energized in a completely different way. One thing I've learned is that not all tiredness is the same. There's the exhaustion that comes from living against yourself, and there's the tiredness that comes from having done something meaningful. Those feel very different in the body. So don't let fear borrow the language of self-care. Don't let avoidance disguise itself as wisdom. Instead, become curious. Ask yourself, is this costing me energy, or is it asking me to be brave? Because the life you're trying to build will almost certainly require both good stewardship of our energy and moments of real courage. It's never one or the other. It's learning the dance between them. And perhaps that's another way of thinking about an extraordinary creative life. Not as a perfectly balanced life, but as one where over time you become wiser about what restores you, what stretches you, what depletes you, and what helps you grow. I still get that wrong, don't get me wrong. There are weeks when I overbook myself because I'm excited. There are other weeks when I realise I've quietly started hiding behind being busy at home. I'm still learning. I suspect I always will be, but I'm getting better at noticing. And perhaps that's all any of us are trying to do, not to become perfect, but become more aware, because awareness gives us choice, and choice is where our creativity begins. So before we finish, I want to leave you with one final thought. Everything I've talked about today has been part of this journey that we have some agency over. Understanding ourselves, getting curious about our patterns, learning the conditions that help us flourish. Designing a creative life that works with our body rather than constantly fighting against it. Those things matter enormously, but they're only part of the picture, because sometimes the barrier isn't inside us at all. Sometimes it's the room we're expected to work in. Sometimes it's the structure or the opportunity. Sometimes it's the assumption that professionalism looks like being endlessly available, physically present, able to travel at short notice or work long hours, unpredictable hours. And for many disabled artists, chronically ill artists, neurodivergent artists, and people with caring responsibilities, those barriers are real. They're not imagined. They're not a lack of confidence. They aren't something you can simply think your way out of. So I don't want today's conversation to leave you feeling that the responsibility sits entirely with you. It doesn't. Yes, we can become more curious about ourselves. Yes, we can build kinder conditions for ourselves, and we can learn to work with our body instead of constantly arguing with it. But we also deserve creative industries, organisations, galleries, museums, festivals, commissioners who are willing to meet us halfway, who understand that access isn't a favour. It's part of making great work possible. So I'd like to continue this conversation next week, because I want to move from the personal to the practical. We'll talk about what an access rider is and why I think every creative person, whether they're disabled, chronically ill, neurodivergent, or simply navigated changing life circumstances, can benefit from thinking about one. We'll explore how to understand your conditions well enough to communicate them with confidence. We'll look at artists, curators and organisations who are leading the way in this work, including organisations like Dash, artist curator Aidan Mosby, and others who've been thinking deeply about access, care and creative practice for years. And we'll ask a different question, not simply how do I adapt to the art world, but how might the art world adapt so that more extraordinary creative people can participate? because I honestly believe we all have a role to play in creating a more thoughtful, more generous and more accessible creative culture. Until then, I'd love you to notice just one thing that genuinely helps you. One condition that makes it easier to think, one conversation that leaves you feeling more alive, one place where your creativity feels just a little more at home. Because every extraordinary creative life is built one condition at a time. Thank you for spending this time with me. If something in this episode landed for you, please share it with one person who needs to hear it. Come and find me on Instagram at Kerryhand, that's CERIHAND, and join thousands of creatives reading my weekly newsletter at kerryhand.com/subscribe for practical advice you can use this week straight to your inbox every Friday. Until then, keep making the work that only you can make.